Today in the EU, World Bank report, Agrifood biggest climate change contributor, urgent investment needed. A recent report from the World Bank highlights that middle-income countries are leading contributors to global emissions from the agri-food system. The study underscores the urgent need for investments in reducing agri-food emissions. It suggests that investments must surge by 18-fold, amounting to approximately 240 billion euros annually. Hello and welcome. I am Evi Chiori, and this is Today in the EU. To break this down, I brought in the studio Maria Simon Arboleas, our Agrifood reporter. Maria, as a starter, maybe you can share with our listeners what is the study about and what it shows in general.
Yes, so the main message of the report is that the system that feeds us is also significantly contributing to feeding the climate crisis. But the study also brings good news because it says that the recipe to fix this problem is out there, available to us. So the authors say that there are practical measures to bring those emissions down and that what is needed is a sharp increase in investments in the sector. So, for example, in the EU, the big focus should be on shifting demand towards more sustainable food options, according to the study.
Now, let's make it a little bit more specific. What percentage of global greenhouse gas emissions does the agri-food sector account for, as described in the report?
So we're talking big numbers here because the authors said it is almost a third of global greenhouse gas emissions.
That is big.
Yeah.
Now, we know that the previous parliamentary and commission mandate set some goals regarding the EU's targets for greenhouse gas emissions reduction by 2030 and climate neutrality by 2050.
The European Union has peaked already. We have reduced emissions and we are on track to overshoot our target for 2030. And we just adopted a law to drastically reduce methane emissions,
said Commissioner President Ursula von der Leyen at COP28 in Dubai. How is this still achievable, and will this be a policy in the next Monday's priorities?
The World Bank's report makes it clear that at the current path, the EU, as well as the rest of the world, of course, is off track to meet its climate goals. So the bloc will need, of course, to step up its efforts, and it's not the first study to say so, because, for example, on the agricultural front, back in January, we reported on a study by the European Scientific Climate Board that warned that farmers in the EU lacked incentives to play their part in reducing emissions.
The Commission responded to the report from the Climate ADV Board, welcoming the findings and recommendation on the Climate Advisory Board report.
The Commission broadly agrees with the findings and the recommendations of the report on the path to climate neutrality, and we will be taking them into account as we develop our recommendations for a 2040 emissions.
Highlighted press officer for Climate Action and Energy, Tim McPhee.
Meanwhile, farmers recently took out to the streets across the bloc, claiming that it is becoming more and more difficult to make a living out of agriculture. So it is clear that this question on how to make the two possible, so to make farming more sustainable while easing the sector's financial strain, will be key in the next term. And of course, parties are aware of it. So we have extensively reported on how politicians of all colors are making agriculture a focal point in their campaigns.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit on this, like how agriculture became one of the main topics in the agenda of many parties.
Of course, many tried to jump on the bandwagon of protests, claiming to be the Farmers' Party.
Indeed, it was EPP that renamed themselves as a party of the farmers.
Our food security depends on the security of our farmers' livelihoods. Therefore, the system must be put back on a sustainable footing. Their hard work has to pay off. And I want to be very clear. EPP will always be on the side of our farmers, my friends.
Ursula von der Leyen during the EPP's Bucharest Congress.
Unfortunately, Madam von der Leyen, what we have seen is that you are lowering and really watering down the Green Deal for our farmers, as if green policies are the problem. The real problem of our farmers is they don't have a decent income. The profits go to the agro industry, they go to the supermarkets, they determine the prices and not the farmers. If you really want to help the farmers, you need to do something about our market model where the farmers are paying the price. And instead of that, you are pretending to help them by just removing some green policies. That is scapegoating green policies over the back of the real concerns that the farmers have.
Said Bas Eickhout, the Greens Spitzenkandidatin, replying to Ursula von der Leyen during the Maastricht debate.
They presented their different stances, maybe more focused on cutting red tape or putting more money into the sustainable transition to claim that that's the way forward. So, of course, as it becomes clearer that the climate targets are difficult to achieve, the answer on how to make this possible is very important.
And to maintain the balance between reducing the emission targets, but also offering farmers a decent way of living through their activity, how do you see the next mandate resolving this issue?
We'll have to see because, of course, in Europe we have the farming subsidies scheme, so the Common Agricultural Policy. The report I just mentioned back in January said that it offers too much flexibility for member states and too many exemptions, so that they were not being ambitious enough. There was too much room to be more or less ambitious. And what's happening actually, it's quite significant because how the Commission responded to the farmers' protest was by proposing to give even more flexibility, so to give member states more room to ease the burden of the green requirements. So we'll have to see, of course, how this translates on the ground and how negotiations for the future Common Agricultural Policy go. But of course, it's like a key moment to find the balance between the two.
Now, it's very interesting to see more specifically regarding agriculture. How do we really cut emissions in the agri-food sector? What is the World Bank study saying?
Yes, so the authors say that in high-income regions like the EU, efforts should be very much focused on switching to low-emission energy resources. They said that work is not done in that direction. And also, as I mentioned before, decreasing the demand for emission-intensive foods through pricing incentives.
What do you mean with the demand and the low prices? Maybe you can tell us a bit more.
Yes, so of course we have food options that are more and less sustainable. And what the experts are saying that is that we need to try to influence demand through pricing. So there are several policies that you can choose there. So you have VAT, of course, you also have promotion, you have public procurement of food. So what they are saying is that, of course, diets need to change, but institutions have a role to play there in encouraging consumers to do so. And then for middle and low-income countries, the recipe is somewhat similar, but also a bit different.
And you mentioned that when we talk about cutting emissions just now, a distinction has to be made to the country's income. Why is that? Can you explain this?
Yes, because, for example, the study points at the fact that while middle-income countries are the biggest contributors to global emissions from the agri-food system, the highest emissions per person are found in high-income countries, so regions like Europe. So the authors say that this difference is due to a heavy consumption of meat and dairy, and wealthier regions, so the less sustainable food options that we were talking about. And also they point to an increase of food transport, processing and packaging in those areas. So given these differences, the authors point to different actions depending on the particularities of every region.
And can you give us some examples of actions to take proposed by the World Bank report?
Yes, so as we were saying before, authors want to encourage the consumption of low-emission foods such as poultry, fruits, and vegetables. And as we mentioned, there are several pathways in that sense. Then for middle and lower-income countries, they say more efforts, for example, should be on preventing deforestation and green technologies as well, of course.
But how much money would we need to actually go in this direction to make everything that you're describing possible?
Yeah, again, we're talking big numbers here. So they say that the annual investments at the global level should increase by 18 times. So we're talking about 240 billion euros per year. This in order to reach the targets that we mentioned at the beginning.
And the text also mentions that little money is invested to cut agri-emissions in general. Is this the case also for the EU? Are we acting upon it just because we know that Commission President Ursula von der Leyen really had as her main policy cutting the emissions? So are we doing enough as EU?
In the agricultural front, we are not, I'm afraid. The report I also mentioned before, the one that was published in January by the Scientific Advisory Board, said that greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture have remained largely unchanged in the EU since 2005.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, the authors in the report of the World Bank we're discussing today say that more money needs to be put in cutting these emissions, but also that the policy tools available need to be reorientated. We mentioned the Common Agricultural Policy before, and we said how these recent changes raise many questions on the way forward.
When you say they raise many questions, what do you mean exactly?
So the political message behind the changes in the Common Agricultural Policy that were backed by the Parliament, by the EU Council, is that member states should have more room of maneuver to give farmers a bit more of a flexibility to ease the administrative and economic burden of green rules. But the question is, are we then going to ambitious goals at EU level? Are we focusing more on the national level? Where is the answer to find a viable transformation towards more sustainable food systems?
And to wrap this up, what should we keep from this report?
Probably the focus on diets. This is a recurrent thing in many reports calling for a bet on more sustainable foods. But of course, the key question remains how to make this possible, how to influence consumers' decisions. So it's about money, as the author said, about investments, but it's also about seeing at the options that we have on the table already.
Thank you very much, Maria, for joining us on this episode. I am Evi Chiori, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed or followed us yet, you can find us on all streaming platforms. Also, make sure to leave a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help us a lot to spread the word about our work. This episode was produced by Miriam Sáenz de Tejada, Nicoleta Yonta, and myself. Thank you for tuning in, and we will be with you again tomorrow morning. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.